I thought it was just another Tuesday. The kind where nothing dramatic happens, where you can pretend your life is normal. I was standing in line at the grocery store, half listening to a podcast, when the cashier scanned my debit card and frowned. "Sorry, it says declined," she murmured, like she was embarrassed for me. I forced a smile. "Try it again?" She did. Same error. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and felt the ground drop out from under me. My checking balance showed negative $28,903.41, red text I'd never seen in my life. And right below it, a frozen alert on my savings account. I don't remember the rest of the checkout line. Just that somehow I ended up in my car, the groceries abandoned on the counter. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might pass out. I called the bank. The first rep transferred me to someone else. The second rep put me on hold. The third finally cleared her throat and said in a practiced, gentle voice, "Sir, the reason your accounts are frozen is due to non-payment on the business loan." "What business loan?" I croaked. "The commercial loan issued 18 months ago for $400,000. She said. "Your name and social security number are on the application." It felt like she was speaking another language. There must be a mistake," I stammered. "I don't even have a business." I could hear her typing. "The loan was taken out for Cedar Ridge Brewing Company," she said. "According to our records, you were the guarantor." My brother's brewery. The one he'd been bragging about for years. The one my parents kept insisting was on the verge of taking off. And suddenly, in one cold rush, I understood. I ended the call, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. For a while, I just sat there in the parking lot, staring at the dashboard. My mind kept looping back to the moment I'd signed some old tax documents my mother had mailed to my apartment. She told me it was just paperwork to consolidate the family trust. I'd been working a double shift. I hadn't even read them. God, how stupid could I have been? When I finally pulled myself together enough to drive home, I could barely see the road. I spent the next hour tearing apart every drawer, every file box, hunting for any proof that this wasn't real. But there it was, a copy of the loan agreement, my forged signature neatly printed on the last page. I thought I'd felt betrayal before. When my parents ignored my graduation. When they laughed at my freelance work. But this was different. This was them stealing my future. The phone rang, my mom's number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Again. The third time, I picked up because I wanted to hear it from her own mouth. "Ryan," she began, her voice syrupy with practiced concern. "You got the bank call, didn't you?" "You did this," I whispered. "It's not what you think," she said quickly. "It's temporary. Your brother just needed some collateral, and the bank was being unreasonable. You forged my signature." There was a silence so long I could hear her swallow. "You have to understand, honey. Family has to support each other." I felt something in me go cold. "Don't call me again," I said. I hung up and stood there in my apartment, my hands still trembling. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even desperation. It was a choice. And I was about to make mine. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of forged paperwork in front of me, turning the pages over and over, like some part of me still needed proof it was real. When the sun finally came up, I called the bank again. This time, I asked to speak to their fraud department. The woman on the line sounded sympathetic in the way people do when they're used to cleaning up after other people's betrayals. She walked me through the steps: affidavits to sign, ID to submit, police reports to file. I hung up feeling like my chest was full of gravel. Around 10, my father called. The screen lit up with Dad, a word that felt foreign now. I let it ring. He called again. And again. On the third try, I picked up. "You've been ignoring your mother," he said, skipping any greeting. His voice was the same as it had always been, calm, certain he was in the right. "You forged my signature," I said. My own voice sounded small in my ears. "We did what we had to," he replied. "Jason's business was going under. We couldn't let it fail." You're young, Ryan. You'll recover. That's $400,000, I whispered. He exhaled, like I was being unreasonable. You don't understand what family responsibility looks like. One day you'll get it. Until then, you need to stop acting like a victim. I hung up without another word. By noon, I'd taken a personal day from work. My boss, who'd always been kind to me, told me to take whatever time I needed. I could hear pity in her voice, and it made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I drove to the police station. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, trying to convince myself to go inside. Part of me still clung to the idea that this was just a bad misunderstanding, that they'd apologize and we'd somehow fix it. But another part of me knew better. When I finally walked up to the front desk and told the officer I needed to file a fraud report against my own parents, I felt something in me go quiet, like a door shutting. The officer took my statement patiently. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded and wrote everything down. Family fraud happens more than you'd think, she said when she handed me the report copy. I'm sorry you're going through it. I thanked her, but the words felt hollow. On the way home, I drove past Cedar Ridge Brewing Company. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a sad little brick building with a banner that said Grand Opening Now on tap, the edges already curling in the wind. My brother's truck was parked in the back. I thought about stopping, about marching inside and demanding answers. But I knew how that conversation would go. Jason would shrug and tell me to relax, that the money would come back eventually, that I was overreacting. Instead, I drove home. The next morning, my mother was waiting outside my apartment when I left for work. She stepped in front of me, eyes red, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than I remembered. Ryan, she pleaded, please don't do this. If you press charges, we could lose the house. You should have thought of that before you stole from me. Her mouth trembled. We're your parents. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't know this person anymore. Maybe I never had. You made your choices, I said. Now I'm making mine. I walked past her without another word. For once, she didn't follow. If you've never had to prove you didn't take out a loan you never signed, I hope you never find out what it feels like. It's 100 tiny humiliations strung together, strangers poring over your finances, credit agencies treating you like a cautionary tale, friends asking in careful voices if maybe you'd agreed to help, and just regretted it later. Every morning for weeks, I woke up with a knot in my chest. My phone buzzed constantly, collections calls, legal notices, half apologies from my mother that sounded more like demands to let it go. Jason never called once. I hired an attorney. I drained most of my emergency fund to pay her retainer, and even then, she warned me the process would take months. Maybe longer. You're in a good position, she said, tapping the file with her pen. Your income's clean, your signature doesn't match the paperwork, and we have evidence you were living in another state when this was signed. It didn't feel like a good position. At night, I'd lie awake in my apartment, listening to the radiator tick and wondering if my parents were losing any sleep over what they'd done. Somehow, I doubted it. They'd always been good at telling themselves any lie that made their choices easier to live with. In the middle of all this, I kept working. I had to. My freelance contracts were the only reason I could keep the lights on while my accounts stayed frozen. I learned to ration everything: groceries, gas, how much energy I had left to explain my situation to people who'd never understand. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the shame. Even when logic told me I hadn't done anything wrong, some voice in the back of my head whispered that maybe this was proof I was as naive and pathetic as my father always hinted. That I deserved it for thinking I could ever outrun them. One night, after a particularly brutal phone call with a collections agent who kept insisting I just needed to take responsibility, I slammed my laptop shut and sat in the dark, shaking. My phone rang almost immediately, Olivia's name on the screen. She was one of the few people I still answered for. Have you eaten anything today? She asked. She didn't bother with small talk. Not really. I'm coming over. 20 minutes later, she was knocking at my door with takeout and that steady look that always made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely alone. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while I picked at my food. I keep thinking, I said finally, that if I just explained it right, they'd understand how much they've ruined. Her eyes softened. Ryan, they don't care. You could write a 100-page essay with footnotes, and it wouldn't matter. I know, I whispered. But it still feels like I have to try. You don't, she said. You don't owe them understanding. Or forgiveness. I looked down at my hands, raw from stress and too many nights scrubbing dishes to distract myself. What do I owe them? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Nothing. After she left, I sat in the quiet, her words echoing in my head. Nothing. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to wait for an apology. Or an explanation. I was going to finish clearing my name, and then I was going to make sure they understood exactly what it cost to betray me. The next day, I called my attorney and told her to proceed with everything. Civil charges. Criminal charges. Whatever it took. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, I'd show them I could do the same. The court date came faster than I'd expected. A part of me kept hoping my parents would back down before it got that far. That they'd call and admit what they did, offer to fix it, apologize in some way that felt real. But they didn't. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse, my palms sweating. My attorney, Ms. Whitaker, was flipping through the thick folder of evidence we'd compiled, affidavits, my notarized statement, the forensic handwriting analysis proving the signature wasn't mine. She looked up and caught me staring at the building like it might swallow me whole. You ready? She asked. No. But I nodded anyway. Inside, the hall was crowded. My parents were already seated at the long table opposite us. My mother looked down at her hands the entire time. My father was talking quietly to their lawyer, but his eyes kept darting toward me, cold, calculating, like he still couldn't believe I'd forced them to show up here. Jason wasn't there. He hadn't bothered to come. When the judge called us to order, I felt my stomach twist so hard I thought I might be sick. But then Ms. Whitaker started speaking, her voice calm and certain, laying out the facts like she was reading a shopping list. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. She presented the signature analysis, the time-stamped emails proving I was out of state, the bank records showing the funds deposited directly into my brother's business account. The judge listened in silence, only occasionally asking a clarifying question. My parents' lawyer tried to object, tried to suggest I'd known about the loan and simply changed my mind. But every time, Ms. Whitaker calmly dismantled the argument with another piece of evidence. I kept my eyes on the table. I didn't want to see my mother cry. Or watch my father pretend he hadn't done this. When it was over, the judge looked at my parents for a long moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This is fraud, he said simply. And I see no credible evidence that Mr. Reynolds consented. The bank accounts will be unfrozen pending repayment. Civil penalties and restitution will proceed. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal review. My father flinched, just barely. My mother finally looked up. For the first time, her expression wasn't pleading or manipulative. It was just hollow. Like she'd finally realized there was no version of this where I'd pretend it was okay. Afterward, I walked out into the bright afternoon light, the courthouse steps almost blinding. Ms. Whitaker clapped me gently on the shoulder. You did the right thing, she said. I didn't answer. Because part of me still didn't feel like this was a victory. It just felt like a funeral for the version of my family I'd been trying to believe in. When I got home, I found a voicemail from my mother. Ryan, please. We didn't think it would go this far. You have to understand. I deleted it before she finished. I didn't need to hear any more justifications. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same place I'd first spread out all those papers. And I realized something that made my throat ache. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. They'd shown me exactly who they were. And I believed them. The weeks after the hearing were quieter than I expected. My phone, which had been a non-stop soundtrack of threats and fake sympathy, finally stopped buzzing. No more collections calls. No more voicemails from my mother starting with Ryan, please, and ending with "we did this for your own good." For a while, the silence felt suspicious. Like maybe they were just taking a breath before the next ambush. But the only thing that showed up was a letter from their lawyer, politely reminding me that pursuing criminal charges would irreparably damage the family bond. I didn't reply, because the bond was already dust. With the bank freeze lifted, I thought maybe I could start piecing things back together. Then I looked at my balances and realized the freedom I'd regained came with exactly $162.47 to my name. It was humbling. Or humiliating. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. I kept working my day job at the logistics company, answering phones for people who treated me like an automated menu. At night, I'd come home, sit at the kitchen table with a cup of stale coffee, and try to convince myself I hadn't lost everything that mattered. One evening, Olivia called to check on me. I was halfway through explaining how fine I was, voice perfectly flat, no inflection, when she cut me off. "Ryan," she said, "I love you, but you sound like you're about 3 bad days away from moving into a storage unit. Only if they have good Wi-Fi." I muttered. "Why don't you start taking clients again? You're good at it. You've always been good at it." It was such an obvious idea, I felt stupid for not thinking of it first. I hung up and sat there for a while, staring at the sticky note with my last grocery budget scrawled on it. Then I opened my laptop. That same night, I made a listing on a freelance marketplace. It was nothing fancy, just a single paragraph about web development and a photo where I looked approximately 70% less defeated than I felt. The first job was for a bakery 2 towns over. They needed their site fixed because the checkout button was stuck in an endless loading loop. I charged them $200, an amount that felt both insulting and life-saving. When the invoice cleared, I held my phone in both hands like it might disappear. I took another job. Then another. A realtor needed help automating appointments. A dog groomer wanted an online store for his overpriced pet shampoo. I didn't care who they were or what they needed. As long as the work kept coming, I'd do it. Within 3 months, I'd paid off half my legal bills and bought groceries without putting anything back on the shelf. That was my personal barometer for progress. If I could stand in the checkout line without mentally calculating what I had to sacrifice, I was winning. The day I realized my freelance income had overtaken my day job salary, I sat in my cubicle for an extra hour, just staring at my screen. I wasn't sure if I was going to laugh or cry. When my boss walked by, I blurted out that I was quitting before I lost my nerve. He blinked, then smiled, like he'd been expecting it the whole time. "Good for you, Ryan," he said. "Don't come back." I almost hugged him. That weekend, I officially registered my business, Reynolds Digital Solutions. The woman at the licensing office asked if I had employees. I told her no, just me. She nodded like she'd seen 100 guys exactly like me, burned out, tired, but too stubborn to give up. Later that night, Olivia came over with a 6-pack and 2 cupcakes she insisted were symbolic. I never asked symbolic of what. We sat on my floor, toasting to the fact that rock bottom made a surprisingly sturdy foundation. "You know," she said, licking frosting off her thumb, "most people would have let this destroy them." "Give me time," I deadpanned. "I can still have a nervous breakdown by Christmas." She rolled her eyes and raised her bottle. "To your inevitable nervous breakdown, and everything you'll build before it." We clinked bottles. And for the first time since the day my card got declined in that grocery store, I felt something that almost resembled hope. I thought the fallout would be immediate. A dramatic phone call. Maybe a tearful confession. Some desperate attempt to make everything disappear. Instead, my parents decided to pretend they were the victims. A week after the hearing, I got a certified letter, because apparently, regular passive aggression wasn't fancy enough. The letter was from their lawyer, written in that smug legalese that somehow manages to be both polite and insulting. "Dear Mr. Reynolds, we are writing to demand that you cease and desist from making defamatory statements about our clients. Our clients contend that your characterization of the situation constitutes slander and emotional harm." Translation: How dare you tell people we committed a felony? I shredded the letter, poured myself a cup of the cheapest coffee in my pantry, and got back to work. Because I was too busy rebuilding my life to care about their fragile reputations. That didn't stop them from trying. Every few days, my mother sent an email. Each one read like it had been drafted by someone flipping between a guilt manual and a thesaurus. We didn't steal from you, Ryan. We borrowed. Your brother was in crisis. Family supports each other in hard times. Sure. Just like family occasionally forges your signature and tanks your credit score for sport. Meanwhile, Jason's brewery was slowly dying. I'd drive past Cedar Ridge Brewing Company on my way to client meetings, and every time, the place looked more pathetic. The grand opening banner had faded to a weird shade of hospital pink. Half the windows were covered in construction paper. One day, someone taped up a sign in all caps, under new management soon. I'm not proud of it, but I took a photo and sent it to Olivia with the caption, "Karma's on tap." She replied with a single thumbs up emoji. While they scrambled, I kept building. My little digital agency started picking up real momentum. A landscaping company hired me to overhaul their booking system. A regional chain of coffee shops needed e-commerce setup. For the first time in months, I could walk into the grocery store and buy whatever I wanted without mentally calculating whether a pack of chicken thighs would overdraft my account. The district attorney's office reached out about a formal investigation. When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. Like I'd finally reached the part of the marathon where you're too numb to remember why you started running in the first place. Olivia stopped by that evening with takeout. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while I sifted through the latest pile of legal mail. They could actually end up with criminal charges, she said. I picked up a letter and read the opening line, some fresh attempt to blame me for their problems, before tossing it back in the pile. Maybe next they'll accuse me of witchcraft, I said dryly. You okay? Nope, I said, stabbing a dumpling with more force than necessary. But at least I'm consistently not okay. She smiled, just a little. That's progress. Later that week, my mother called. When I didn't answer, she left a voicemail in her best martyr voice. Ryan, please. We never wanted this to go so far. We're losing everything. Your father hasn't been sleeping. Jason is devastated. Can't you just call me back? I listened to the entire message, set the phone on the counter, and then deleted it without hesitation. If they thought I was going to rescue them, they'd underestimated just how much I'd learned about boundaries, and how good it felt not to let guilt run my life anymore. One evening, I drove past the brewery again. The parking lot was empty. The lights were off. A handwritten sign said, "Closed for restructuring." I didn't stop to read the fine print. I already knew what it said. That they'd run out of other people to save them. And I was too busy saving myself to care. I didn't mark the exact day when everything finally stopped feeling like a crisis. It wasn't some big cinematic moment. More like a slow unwinding, a quiet realization that I'd gone a whole week without waking up with my stomach in knots. One morning, I opened my email and found a message from the district attorney's office. The subject line was so bland it took me a second to understand it was important. Reynolds vs. Reynolds case resolution. The email said the investigation was concluding. The evidence was clear enough to proceed if I wanted. They were ready to file charges. My parents could face probation, restitution orders, maybe even jail time if the court decided to make an example. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to click reply and say, "Do it." Part of me wanted to close the laptop and never think about any of this again. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Olivia. "They're ready to press charges," I said. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I rubbed a hand over my face. "I don't know. You don't owe them mercy," she said gently. "But you don't owe them vengeance either." That was the thing no one tells you about betrayal. Even when you win, there's no clean satisfaction. Just the knowledge that you survived it, and that surviving doesn't always feel triumphant. I took the weekend to think. I went for long walks around my neighborhood, past all the houses with their tidy lawns and warm porch lights. Families eating dinner together, laughing. The normalcy of it all made something ache in my chest. Sunday night, I wrote back to the DA. I am not requesting further criminal action. The civil judgment is sufficient. I want this to be over. I hit send. Then I turned off my computer, put on some music, and lay on the floor until my thoughts stopped looping. The next day, I got a call from my father. It was the first time he'd used his own voice instead of a lawyer's. "Ryan," he began. The pause stretched out so long, I thought he might hang up. "I heard you aren't pressing charges," he said eventually. "That's right." More silence. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he muttered. "Thank you?" "No," I said quietly. "I don't expect anything from you anymore." He cleared his throat. "We never meant." I hung up before he could finish. I wasn't interested in hearing the excuses anymore. They'd spent enough time explaining why betraying me was necessary. I didn't need the encore. Later that week, I met Olivia for coffee. We sat in the corner booth we always claimed, the one by the window with the squeaky seat. She listened while I told her about the call. "You think you'll ever talk to them again?" she asked. I thought about it. About the hollow look on my mother's face at the hearing. The way my father's voice sounded when he realized I didn't care about his apologies. "No," I said finally. "And I'm okay with that." She nodded, like she'd been waiting for me to say it. We talked about other things after that. Her new job, my latest client contract, the way the world felt when you finally stepped out from under someone else's thumb. For the first time in months, I laughed without it catching in my throat. When I got home that night, I took the fat folder labeled Reynolds vs. Reynolds and dropped it in the back of my closet. Not because I was pretending it never happened, but because it didn't need to define me anymore. And in a small, unremarkable way, that felt like closure. The last time I heard from my parents, it wasn't a call or an email. It was a letter. It came in a pale blue envelope with my mother's careful handwriting across the front. For a while, I just left it on the kitchen counter, next to the stack of client invoices and take-out menus. Every time I walked past, my chest tightened. A week later, on a rainy Thursday, I finally opened it. "Ryan, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I hope you do. We didn't mean for any of this to happen. We thought we were protecting the family. I know you don't believe that, but it's the truth as we saw it. I'm sorry we hurt you. I hope someday you can forgive us. Love, Mom." There was no mention of what they'd taken. No real acknowledgement that protecting the family meant destroying my credit, my savings, and any trust I'd ever had left. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Then I dropped it in a drawer I almost never opened, where it could stay, out of sight, out of my life. Because by then, I didn't need their validation. Or their explanations. The business kept growing. Reynolds Digital Solutions landed a contract with a regional healthcare network, the biggest I'd ever signed. I hired my first part-time assistant, a college kid named Ben who reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't been in a long time. Ambitious. A little scared. Determined to prove he could build something without anyone's permission. Some evenings, I'd stay late in the office, just a spare bedroom with a second-hand desk and a plant I kept forgetting to water, and look around at everything I'd built. No inheritance. No shortcuts. Just work and grit, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. People like to say that time heals everything. I don't know if that's true. Time didn't erase what happened. It didn't make me forget the look on my father's face when he realized I wasn't going to be the compliant son anymore. It didn't soften the memory of standing in the grocery store while the cashier apologized for my declined card. But time did something else. It made all of it smaller. The betrayal used to feel like the defining fact of my life. Now, it was just one story among 1,000. Something that had happened to me, not something that was me. One night, Olivia and I sat on my sagging couch, splitting a pizza and talking about how far we'd come since the day she found me in my kitchen, surrounded by bank statements and shame. "You ever think about how different it could have been?" she asked. "Every day," I said. "Regret it?" I took a sip of my drink. Thought about it. "Not anymore," I said honestly. "If they hadn't done what they did, I'd probably still be waiting for their approval. Still wondering if I'd ever be enough." She raised her glass. "To being enough." I clinked mine against hers. to never asking them again. After she left, I stood at the window, watching the streetlights glint off the rain. I thought about the word family, how it could be a comfort or a curse, depending on who you gave it to. I used to think I owed them loyalty because we shared blood. But loyalty isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. And I finally understood, I didn't owe them anything. That realization didn't feel bitter. It felt clean. The next morning, I woke up early. Made good coffee instead of the cheap stuff. Logged into my business dashboard and looked at the numbers, at the list of clients waiting for my help. My own name at the top of the LLC paperwork. A life that belonged to me. A life I'd chosen. And that was enough.